And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. And joining me, as always, is Shayne Kubas, contributor for Still Curtain. We're going to get to a little bit of news here this morning. We're going to break down the Steelers' tight end position, kind of going position by position here before we jump back into some training camp action. And then we're also going to talk about the potential players who could emerge as all pros for the Steelers in 2023. So let's kick things off, Shayne, with the news. This week is very slow in terms of the way the news is right now. And this is kind of unusual for Omar Khan to have a few week gap where there's really nothing going on.
This offseason, yeah.
So what we know this week is Lane Johnson appeared on Richard Sherman's podcast where he listed his top 5 edge defenders in the NFL, top 5 pass rushers. TJ Watt made the list. Not too surprising, other than the fact, Shayne, that these two players have only met once in their career in the regular season. That was back in 2020. In that game, Watt had a sack, 3 tackles for a loss, and 3 quarterback hits. Pressure-wise, if you go back and watch that game, I remember it. I didn't go back and watch it since Johnson did this, but I do kind of remember how that game went. And Watt wasn't perfect, like snap to snap, because again, you're going against the best right tackle in football.
Right.
But it was a pretty solid game overall. Just interesting because I feel like a lot of times these tackles who list the best competition they go against, it typically are guys within their own conference or more specifically within their own division. And Johnson did that as well, listing 2 Dallas Cowboys, Micah Parsons and Tank Lawrence. But it's interesting that he had Watt in there as well.
Yeah, I think the thing with Watt, and I think especially for offensive tackles, because you see a lot of, like, there's been a lot of players that have put their edge rankings out there, like guys that think are their top 5 edges recently. Feels like every week I see someone talking about, oh, who's your top 5 this or that. And a lot of them have left TJ off, and a lot of those guys are players who don't play on the offensive line. And I think for tackles, TJ is such a unique player in terms of how he plays that I think it makes it a unique challenge for a lot of tackles because of his fluidity and the fact that he's very patient. He is very smart. He's not relying just on physical gifts like some guys are, like primarily on physical gifts, right? And I think for a guy like Lane, because he is so physically talented, like guys who are real physical freaks, not that TJ isn't, but guys who rely on that stuff for just straight power, speed, they don't give him as much problems as a guy like TJ might, just because again he has the ability to play chess games with him and try to counter stuff the Lane might throw at him. So that I feel like plays a part in that, and the fact that he's more of a meticulous rusher opposed to just a pure fire breather off the edge type.
Yeah, and Lane Johnson's no Joe Schmo here either.
No,
we're talking
exactly,
about all-pro, multi-time all-pro offensive tackle. I'm surprised he hasn't gotten more accolades in his career for how great he has been. I think he's been one of the 2 or 3 best offensive tackles of this past decade in football. And so for him to list TJ Watt, even though they've only had that one head-to-head contest, is interesting. And now I understand, Shayne, the people that are leaving TJ Watt off of these top 5 lists, if you are strictly going by the TJ Watt we've seen in 2021 and 2022, the injured TJ Watt, the hip knee and groin injuries, 2021, the time with the pec tear. If we're projecting forward and saying, I'm assuming a healthy TJ Watt in going into 2023, it's hard to leave him off of that.
Yes, it's a different story then. Yeah. So, sure.
So let's talk about the only other thing really happening right now is George Pickens kind of making some headlines here a little bit. Dan Orlovsky of Get Up praising George Pickens, saying that he could unlock a new level this year, were his exact words. And when he talked about that, he talked about how remarkable he was at the catch point and how he was able to catch over 10% more than what was expected of him, according to Next Gen Stats.
Yeah.
Shayne, that puts him in very rare company with players like DeAndre Hopkins, Stephon Diggs, and Doug Baldwin, of players to do so in this Next Gen Stats era. And so Orlovsky seems to be very encouraged by what he's going to do. I'm sorry, this is Bill Barnwell I'm talking about now. I'm getting my people.
Yeah.
Yes. Orlovsky said, I'm mixing the two together. Orlovsky says unlock a new level. Barnwell is the one who threw the Next Gen Stat out there that I thought was really interesting, because it was a very short list of players, and Hopkins is one of the only players to do it twice. And Pickens already has done it in a season. And again, that stat I'm referring to is catch more than 10% of the targets thrown at you, that higher than what was expected. So Next Gen, one of their advanced analytics, tracks the number of catches expected to make, and Pickens was obviously 10%. I think we believe he was at 11% higher than that, which again is a pretty impressive mark. What do you make of this stat? Is it just like an arbitrary number, or is this something to really dive into?
Well, I think it's fun when analytics mesh with what you see, right? Because there's a lot of talk about, like how much do you put in analytics, and I think that all of them mean something, but especially with something like that, like catches over expectation. That is exactly what we think of with George, right? It's the ability to make the incredible plays and the ability to contort your body and make catches that just most receivers physically can't do. So it makes sense that he would be in that list, especially because I think, especially at the catch point and just his ability in that way, the closest comp for him probably is the DeAndre Hopkins type, right? Now, he doesn't have the run after catch that Hopkins has shown and some of the other things, and that's what you hope he can develop into. But I think stylistically, especially that part of their game does line up, and that's probably why he's on that list with a guy like him. So I think the potential, we've talked about it with George, it's really about how far can they push that skill set effectively, and then how much more can he add, right? Because he's still a very young player. He has the burst and explosiveness, I think, to be a run after catch threat if they allow him to be. It's just, can he separate well enough? He doesn't have to be an elite separator. He doesn't have to be Deontay or some of these other guys. But if he can just separate, at an average level, I mean, he could be a consistent wide receiver one type for a team just based off that alone.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a 22-year-old receiver who had over 800 yards, five touchdowns as a rookie on just 84 targets, I believe. And
on
so
a bad passing offense too.
On a bad passing offense
Yeah.
with a quarterback change and a rookie. And so there's an array of things working against him, not to mention Matt Canada and the fact that Pickens had the smallest route tree in the NFL. So that's another thing to throw in there as well. You mentioned DeAndre Hopkins. I remember watching Pickens at Georgia during his freshman season and being like, this kid has it. Whatever that is, this kid has it because he's so good at the catch point. He was that 5-star recruit, number 2 recruits at his position in the nation. And you could just see that star potential. And so where Hopkins has him easily beat is the route running and just the precision. And so if Pickens can hone in on that part of his craft, something that we would have liked to see progress more from his freshman season in college to where it is right now. If he can get better in that area, perhaps he could have be a Hopkins type of receiver in the NFL. And that's how he's going to win. It's not going to be, even though he did test as a good athlete, a 93rd percentile athlete, according to his RAS, I don't think he's going to win with the guy that burns you down the field or that just explodes after the catch. He's going to have to refine that route running a little bit, and he's going to be a monster at the catch point throughout his career, I would say. Anything else you want to add there, Shayne?
No, just real quick, because we didn't want to make it a big thing because a lot of outlets have, and I thought it was kind of weird the way they're covering it. But congrats to Kenny Pickett on the marriage here. He got married recently. I had some teammates there. I'm not gonna dissect it like I've seen the weird stuff with it. I just wanted to throw that out there. Good for Kenny. Hoping that he has a good season and hoping that goes well for him, of course. But
yes, absolutely. Congrats to Kenny there, and it looked like an awesome wedding. If you are joining us here live, please ask us your questions. Throw them in the chat here, and we'll be sure to get to those. Shayne and I love to answer the questions you might have for us. Let's move on to our first discussion topic of today's show, Shayne. And we've been going through position by position. We skipped over quarterback because the outlook is very easy to see.
We know what that should be, at least.
It's going to be Kenny Pickett when hoping that he's healthy all season long, and if barring an injury, Trubisky will come in that case. And we believe that Mason Rudolph's going to obviously come back as the QB3 this year. So we went through the other two positions over these past 2 weeks, running back, wide receiver. We're making our way to tight end today, Shayne, and I want to talk about the outlook at the tight end for the Steelers this year. We're going to make some of our predictions. So let's go ahead and start right off with who's going to make the roster at tight end for the Steelers if you had to put money on it right now.
So, I mean, it's a tough position to be in because if trying to predict that, because it kind of depends on what you consider Connor Hayward to be. So if you're listing him as a tight end, I think that realistically he's going to make the roster in some capacity. So if he's a tight end, I think they keep 4 tight ends, but him being that more H-back type of player opposed to being a true tight end. So obviously you have Pat Freiermuth, is going to be the starting tight end. Darnell Washington, we assume, whether it's immediately or shortly thereafter, will be this team's tight end 2 blocker type. And then Zach Gentry returns. I do think he makes the roster, really, regardless of what Connor Hayward's role is. I think they like to have 3 true tight ends this year if they can. So I think those 4 or 3, if you kind of count Connor as the fullback / H-back type, all those guys will make this team, I have to imagine.
Yep, I'm going with the same 4 again, and it really doesn't matter what you want to call Connor
Yeah,
Hayward. I do think
he's
he
going to be
does
here.
play
Yeah.
kind of that move tight end role, but he also plays H-back. I think he's
Yes.
going to the plan is for him to be that fullback. I think that the Steelers kind of realize in terms of offense, certainly you can use Hayward in the role because Derek Watt wasn't really seeing the field on offense. He was
He just
primarily using
he
special
wasn't
teams.
playing enough to justify having a separate fullback when Connor can fill that role well enough, I think.
Yep. So call them what you want. I think those are going to be the 4 as well. I will say though that it is interesting, Shayne, that Steelers got Gentry's deal done before the draft, and I do wonder, like it's always hindsight, but I wonder what the choice they would have made in term with Gentry had they have drafted Darnell Washington first and then decided what to do with him afterwards. And I can still see Gentry certainly being brought back to the team at that point. They did sign him before. It's worth noting at least. But I agree with you. I think that because they'll probably look at Hayward as that Swiss Army knife guy that can do fullback as well. That gives them the leeway because Derek Watt's no longer here. It gives them the leeway and flexibility to devote that other position to a tight end, a 4th position, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And that job is the job that I think is going to belong to Gentry. And look, you got a guy that is 6'8", 265 pounds. Those guys are just hard to come by. And I know that he's, even at his size, he's not the best or most consistent blocker, but he is a quality player in his role. And certainly I think can act as an insurance policy if the Steelers were to get an injury at the position.
Absolutely,
so Shayne, let's talk about how do you think the workload is going to be divided amongst these 4 players this year? And we'll kind of talk about the roles here for a little bit, and then maybe even like how the target distribution is going to look.
So as far as roles, I mean, we kind of know like Pat's going to be the move tight end in per se. Like he's going to be the starting tight end. He's going to be on the field all the time. He's probably, though, especially with the addition of Darnell, he's probably not going to play inline as much as he has. I think that he is going to be used more in that true, like, split out slot tight end type of player. At least you hope so. I mean, I know they brought in Allen Robinson, but realistically, this team's best 11 personnel would technically be Pat in the slot and then the 2 receivers and then Washington or Gentry as the inline tight end. Like that's realistically probably their best passing personnel at this point. So you hope that he does a lot of that. Darnell, I do think whether it's right away, especially if he shows out as a blocker, which we expect him to, will probably be the tight end 2, at least the second tight end on the field whenever they're in run blocking situations. And then you expect that Gentry will be the 3rd true tight end. And then again, Hayward's role is going to be kind of whatever they need him to do. I would assume he's probably going to play in the backfield significantly more just because of that. This year, he's not going to be lined up as a true tight end as much as he was last year, but there's going to be still a role for him as well. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that it's pretty safe to assume those roles. And now, look, you've got 2 mammoth tight ends. I want Pat Freiermuth to go full Travis Kelce now. You're just a slot receiver now. If I had the choice, because I don't think there's much of a reason to play him in line. I don't think I think that's where his worst role is, honestly. And he's not that he's a terrible blocker, but you have guys that hold up there better than what he does. Yes. I think he's a better move blocker, which you can do when you're in the slot and you can put the guy in motion. Have him play that true slot tight end role and I think that he'll be better for it. I think that the team will be better for it. And I think that, like I said, I thought so at the time, and this is the reason why I was huge on Darnell Washington pre-draft. I thought that he was just a perfect complement to Freiermuth. You have Freiermuth, who, although not an elite athlete in terms of testing wise for the position, he's a guy though that he's a good route runner. He catches the ball well.
On the field, he looks like that type of player.
He's smooth. He's just smooth. He's a smooth football player. And so I wanted the big Y tight end to pair with him, and so that he would have to do less of the inline stuff and could be more of a true receiving threat in the offense. And so that's how I'm hoping that it works out. What I will be interested to see, Shayne, is will Gentry be a guy who routinely gets a hat on game day for this team? Is he going to be a guy who doesn't make those active 45 spots? And is he one that's going to kind of just be there in case of an injury, or will the Steelers try to find a way to use all 4 of them?
I think it's very possible that if Washington is 100% like with it ready to go to be that true tight end 2 and the Y tight end in certain situations, then I think that's very possible because Connor has way more versatility. you
Mm,
probably don't need to have 3 active tight ends that are true tight ends, because you can put Hayward as the third tight end if you do go 3 tight end, which obviously most teams, even us, probably aren't going to do that a whole lot. So I think it's possible Gentry could be slid down into that inactive role, at least at times this year. I think if Washington isn't
mm,
like 100% up to speed and ready to go, you could see him be on the roster, be active, but just not be the true tight end 2 to start the year. It's really just, I think, dependent on that. Like, I think if Washington is the guy as a tight end 2, then Gentry might have to slip down a little bit. If he's not quite ready, he'll still be active, but Gentry will probably get a
mm.
lot of the snaps then. So that's probably the number one factor, I'd say, whether he's active or not.
Yeah, I think that that's fair. And speaking of workload here, Shane, let's talk about just specifically their usage in the passing game,
Yeah.
because I think so much of that depends on that. And I think that, well, obviously, Freiermuth and Hayward, those were two of the most efficient pass catchers on this team last
Yes.
year. And
They
so
were.
I think the Steelers will try to utilize the tight ends. They have a strong group, and Freiermuth could kind of maybe put himself in that discussion for a
Most
top 5
important.
player
There you go.
at the position. And so I think, how do you think? Let's just go. First of all, let's just rank these in order. Like, we know that Freiermuth is going to be number 1 in all the receiving categories for the Steelers this year. He's going to be number 1 in targets. How would you rank the 3 players after that in terms of their usage in the passing game? If he's still with us here, I think Shayne's internet is cutting out a little bit. So while Shayne is coming back in here, let me go ahead. Shayne, we've had 2 seasons now. Freiermuth has had 60 receptions or more in each of his first 2 seasons. There's only been one player in history that has done that at the tight end position, and that's Keith Jackson, who started his career with the Eagles with 3 first-team All-Pros in his first 3 seasons. Freiermuth has a chance to be the first tight end in NFL history to catch 60 passes in each of his first 3 seasons. So he will be in company all of his own if he's able to do that. And based on the trajectory he's had so far, I mean, he went from 497 yards to 732 yards. Not only that, but he increased his yards per reception by almost 3 yards from year 1 to year 2, averaging 11.6 yards reception last year. Like, he could jump into that category where he's consensusly looked at as a top 5 tight end around the NFL this year.
So real quick, you can hear me good now? We're good?
I can hear
Okay.
you now. Yes,
Yeah,
I
was having some
went in
things.
turn of you. So
Okay, no, you're good.
you're
So
good now.
no, as far as Pat goes, like I said, he's off to a very hot start for tight ends, especially. You just don't see a lot of guys start their careers quickly at tight end, and just kind of how it goes. It's a very difficult
Mhm.
position to play. It's gotten easier, I would say, for guys like him that aren't necessarily going to be the true, like, do it all tight ends, the ones that have to block and have to worry about receiving, like, because that really is what makes it so difficult. Is you're holding a lot of hats, you're wearing a lot of hats offensively as a tight end. For most guys are. So asking him to come in and do all that is one thing, but his ability in receiving game was immediate, and you could tell that. And I think that this year you're hoping he does develop into a guy that's consistently thought of as a top 5 producer at the position as well, not just a talent, right? Because that's the leap that you have to make as a
Mhm.
player in his position.
Now, Shayne, right before you cut off there, I want you to rank the tight ends, all 4 of these guys in order. Obviously, Freiermuth's going to be number 1, but rank the next 3 in order in terms of their usage in the passing game. Who's going to get the most targets, second, third, and fourth?
So I would say that, just looking at things right now, I think Washington will get the second most targets. I think that he's
Mhm.
going to be one of the guys that they look for in the red zone, you hope, just naturally because of his size. I think that's where he can make an impact year 1 as a pass catcher. I don't think it'll be past that amount. Like, I don't think he'll be able to get too much outside of the red zone just because they don't need him to. But I think that the tight end room is going to be very Freiermuth focused. So asking anyone other than Washington to get more than like 30, 40 targets is a lot. Hayward will catch some balls out of the backfield and do some of that stuff that he did last year for us. And then Gentry, hopefully he doesn't catch many balls at all. I think it's just not really his game. So that's what I'm hoping in terms of order of targets and target share.
Yeah, Freiermuth's going to be first. Gentry's going to be last. The middle 2, I'm interested to see, Shayne,
It could
because
flip either way. It could.
yeah, I mean, I know that Hayward is sub 6 foot and he doesn't have long arms. He's not an elite athlete, but he was just so
Super
efficient in the
efficient.
passing
Yeah.
game last year. Averaged 8.9 yards per target, and caught 12 of 17 passes. And so this is a guy I'd like to see him being used more in that facet of the game. And so I'll be interested to see. I think I wouldn't be surprised if Washington and Hayward, because Hayward now can be used as a fullback, as a move tight end, as the H-back. I wouldn't be surprised if those two are within like 5 to 10 targets of each other by the end of the season. I think that they'll be relatively similar in that regard. But Freiermuth's going to blow everybody out of the water with that. We know that. I'd be really interested, Shayne, because I broke down early in the season. I can't remember which week it was now. I'd have to go back and look.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, Freiermuth was on the pace for, I believe it was 935 receiving yards.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he has not played a 17-game season yet. He missed one as rookie, missed one last year. In addition to more time missed, he sprained his knee in the last game of the season. The concussion, he missed a game and then some. So he's missed some time here. And even with the missed time, we're still talking about a guy who had 63 receptions, 732 yards, a pair of touchdowns. Could have had more in the red zone last year. Opportunities weren't all there. A couple missed throws by Pickett. But this is a guy, I mean, it wouldn't shock me if he becomes this first receiver in I don't know how long to have that 1,000-yard season at the tight end position. And so I would be interested to see how close he comes this year.
I think it's going to be by far the closest he's been of the 2 seasons that he's played so far. I think that it's lining up for him to be able to do that. But it really just comes down to what does Kenny do? How much better is he? How much better can Canada be, right? Because he has to know what he's dealing with, right? He has to be able to use Freiermuth in the way that he needs to be used. And I think that that's still certainly a question mark, but at some point, Canada's going to have to do something different. And he's kind of alluded to things being a little bit different in interviews and things I've seen from him. So you just kind of have to hope that that's what transpires with him.
Yeah, and just for reference here, I just pulled it up. Heath Miller, his most productive season came in 2012 when he made the Pro Bowl and had 816 receiving yards. So Freiermuth in year 2, I mean, potentially could have cracked that already had he not had the injuries that he did last year. So
I would say so. Yeah.
If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain Podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain Podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. And if you are joining us live in here, please drop us your questions.
Please do.
In the chat on YouTube, and we would love to get to those. All right, Shayne, we are going to talk about the Steelers players who could potentially earn All-Pro honors after the 2023 season. And so we're going to start with the most obvious names on the list. We'll get to some that are a little bit more questionable after that. And then we would like to hear what you guys have to think. If you think of anything else, throw them back at us. Shayne, I'm going to start right on the top of the list. And these first 3 are going to be relatively easy.
Yeah,
so let's go.
No surprises here.
Right with it with TJ Watt. No surprise here. The guy's on the Hall of Fame pace. Didn't make All-Pro last year. And that was obviously because of the injury that caused him to miss almost half of the season with that pec tear, but was still labeled a Pro Bowler last year. Probably shouldn't have been. There was some debate there. I mean,
yeah.
For the reason though, Shayne, I think the one thing I can get behind it is the Steelers are horrible without him. And just historically now, this football team is 1-10 when he doesn't play. The sack production gets cut in half. The TFLs get cut in half. And so you average and teams score almost a full touchdown more per game when he's not playing. So for that reason, you can argue that. But because he only played 10 games and had 5 sacks, that Pro Bowl honor probably should have went to somebody else last year. Either way, assuming TJ Watt comes back healthy, is he one of the All-Pro guys? And what I want to do with each of these, Shayne, too, is I want to say who is their biggest competition, because we know how these are awarded. If it's All-Pro, it's not like Pro Bowl where it's just a conference thing. You're taking the best players in the NFL. So are there 2 guys in the NFL at Watt's position who are going to earn that All-Pro honor ahead of him? Now, in the past, there was a year where Watt was listed as a linebacker, and which is kind of bizarre. I think maybe they just want to get 3 edge guys in there because they deserved it more than the linebackers.
Maybe.
But I would have to assume that his biggest competition to be a first-team All-Pro this year, if he wants to make it his 4th time, would be players like Micah Parsons, players like Myles Garrett, and players like Nick Bosa. And those are the big 3 that come to mind. Maybe Max Crosby takes that next leap forward this year. So it's a really good era for edge defenders right now. Do you think that he's going to be a guy that four-peats here in 2023?
I think it's very possible. I think the thing that uniquely makes it easier for him to do that is the amount of different ways he impacts the game on defense for us. Because most of his competition for this award, for any sort of edge related award in general, is, sacks, tackles, for like those guys are going to be up there with him usually, even in his MVP season, the Defensive Player of the Year season. Like, he obviously had the huge sack numbers, but there were other guys in that same realm at least. around him. What makes him uniquely different is he's a guy that can intercept a couple passes. He already did it
Mhm.
last year. You can see him get a lot of plays, even some coverage snaps where he's going to defend a couple passes. He's going to block passes down. He's going to do a lot of stuff his brother did in that regard. Like, he's going to impact the game and the stat sheet differently than some of the other edges. So let's say, maybe a guy has a few more sacks than him, but TJ has more impact in the run game, or he has a couple picks, or he has a bunch of those pass deflections. Like, that's going to, in the minds of the
Mhm.
voters, they're going to think about all the ways he impacted the defense and not just purely going after the quarterback, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why he's so valuable to this team is, unlike a lot of other edge, defenders, if they go down, like, the pass rush might suffer a little bit, but
Mhm.
usually there's ways around certain things, but he does so much in different things for this defense that we really don't have a way to replace him unless it's with multiple players, right? It's not just like, okay, slot another edge in and ask them to do that, because other edges just can't do that stuff. Like, they just usually can't perform at the level that he does in different facets of the game. So that's going to be his edge. Is he's always going to be, okay, there's going to be other guys that have 15, 16 sacks. There's going to be other guys who have a ton of pressures. What else did they do abnormally
Mhm.
outside of the realm of playing edge by itself that could put them over a guy like TJ Watt? I think that's why he probably, other than one other guy that we'll talk
Mhm.
about next, has, I think, the best chance on this team, if he's healthy, to get that honor again this year.
Yeah, and I don't think that gets talked about enough, Shane. I've got a lot of debates that I've had with people about this, and they'll use advanced analytics, and analytics are great. I
They
think that
are. Yeah.
everybody should use them for reference. You shouldn't ignore them completely, obviously. And if you look at analytics, those numbers will typically tell you that the guy that has the higher sack score and the pass rush win rate, and those are your Parsons and your Myles Garrett's, the guys who can get to the quarterback really fast with the bend and everything else. But it's so important not to ignore the fact that TJ Watt's splash play rate is remarkable, and
It's
it's unmatched, really. It's like,
it's
and
really nuts. Yeah.
I gave this example too, Shane. It would be like, it'd be like taking like Trayvon Diggs, the cornerback of Dallas, that 2 years ago had 11 interceptions, and saying you can grade Diggs off of just his play and his man in zone coverage, but you can't consider any of the takeaways that he has. It's really, you're doing the same with Watt
Yeah.
if you're not considering if he gets 5 forced fumbles or 8 pass deflections and a defensive touchdown and a pair of picks or whatever it is. The guy makes so many splash plays, and they come in big moments. Like, the
They
guy
do.
makes more fourth quarter and overtime plays than any edge defender in the league. And so all those things are worth considering, and it's all of them are help make the player who he is and on this Hall of Fame pace that he's on right now. And so
Yeah.
also worth noting, Shane, here is Watt is just 3 sacks away, I believe, from holding the Steelers record. And
Yes.
Hayward could also get there too this
Yeah,
year.
they're
So
kind of gonna
they could be
fight for
kind of going
that.
back
Yeah,
and
back and
forth a little
forth
bit.
for a while. Yeah, but no, I think with Watt too, like, the thing you have to consider is, like, when we're talking about edge rushers versus pass rushers, because being an edge rusher isn't just rushing the
Mhm.
passer, right? There's a difference between asking somebody, okay, who are the 5 best just pure pass rushers? There are a lot of guys who you could argue are
Mhm.
either better than or on the same level as TJ Watt, right? There's a lot of guys who are great at specifically that. And that's the name of the game ultimately, as an edge rusher. That's the most important thing. But when you're asking about edge rushers as a whole, there isn't many, really, I think, ever that have done the multitude of things that TJ does on a week to week basis, while also still managing to be a top of the league sack getter, a guy that does a lot of those types of things still as a pass rusher. It's, again, he's just uniquely
Mhm.
talented and different than a lot of the other edges that he's competing against. That's just what it comes down to ultimately.
Yeah, and like you and I have argued in the past, he might be the only one as well that you can say this guy was legitimately more valuable than our starting quarterback,
Right,
because
because it's
the
in
difference
its
between,
the
yeah.
numbers just kind of show that. It's just what it is. Like,
So
yeah.
I think that there's a strong chance of it happening again, Shane, for him continuing that Hall of Fame pace, getting that first team All Pro this year. He's going to turn 29 in the middle of the season, and so you really, really hope that he can get at least 1 or 2 more here in these
Like true
next 2 or
elite
3 years,
seasons,
because
yeah.
maximize on these final high points of his NFL prime here in these next couple of seasons. Because after that, when you get into your early 30s, it's gonna be much harder to try to get that
Yeah, to
reward
maintain that
with
pace, yeah.
younger guys coming out. And so we want to be able to see him get those accolades. He's going to go down as one of the best Steelers, and so we want to see that from him. And it's always also worth considering, Shane. There's always a few guys that surprise us. There's always a
Yes.
few of those young guys at the bottom of of the discussion right now who could make that leap, like a Jalen Phillips of Miami, or
Yes, big one.
or maybe even like an Aiden Hutchinson in year 2
I
can
was
jump
gonna
up
say
high
that
enough
too,
where
Lions, yeah.
and they could become that new Nick Bosa, where it's like now suddenly we just had another name added. It used to be like it was Garrett and Watt, and now there's suddenly a few more names there. It's a good era for pass rushers.
It
So
really
that's worth
is, and it's
considering.
good for the league because if there wasn't, the quarterbacks would be even more hard to stop. So
Oh yeah, for sure. Second name on the list, Shayne here, another guy who's potentially on a Hall of Fame pace here, and that is Minkah Fitzpatrick. I mean, coming off of what I think is his best season, regardless of what anybody
overall
says. I know,
season, yeah,
I know the defense wasn't as strong last year, but again, you were missing TJ Watt for most of that. So
yeah.
in 2019, I believe the Steelers had the number 1 DVOA defense. It was in 2020, it was number 3. Fitzpatrick had a huge part to do with that. And even this past year, I mean, he missed a game with an appendectomy, came right back, and just played at an all-pro level all season long, improved tremendously as a run defender while still being great in coverage, tying for the lead league in interceptions, and just a routine playmaker. And this is one, Shayne, where I don't think the competition is all that close, honestly. I think that if Fitzpatrick is healthy and out there, I don't see any reason why 2 other safeties in the league would earn first team all pro honors over him. And I'm trying not to let my bias kick in here. I just think that he's kind of that one guy in the NFL right now that really is in a class of his own at the safety position. Maybe Derwin James, but we just haven't seen enough of him healthy over the years.
I just think, like you said, most of the other guys you could say are worthy of that discussion. They either have had injury issues or they haven't had the turnover numbers, they haven't had the splash plays, whatever it is. Like, and that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of great safeties in the league. I think it just, when you look at Minkah, his impact, it's just kind of funny, some of the stuff that he'll do. Like, you'll see him like just break on a pass. Like, there's no shot that quarterback thought that was going to happen. Like, you just can't plan for that stuff. And I think that's, again, it comes down to, with him, if he's healthy and he's getting those turnovers, which, again, he's always around the ball. He has that. And like, this is one of those things that when people talk about football, it's really hard to quantify it or hard to explain it. But like, he just has a nose for the football. Like, when the ball is in the air, there's a high probability that Meek is going to be around it somewhere. And a lot of that is instincts. It's a lot of positioning, understanding the game, all that stuff comes into play. But he, especially right now at the safety position, just feels like you can't put the ball in the air on this team and not wonder if Minka's going to be around. And it's just hard as a quarterback. I think it's really hard. Like, you look at what Joe Burrow did in week 1, like, he had just a dreadful, especially in the beginning of that game, like, just dreadful time. And it was, I think part of it was because Minkah had that pick 6 off from the start. And then he's thinking, okay, where's Minkah at? Probably every time he's throwing the ball. Like, it just gets in, I think it gets in guys' heads sometimes whenever he does get that one pick, right? And then it's like, okay, now I got to think about where's he at every play. And that impact is kind of what helped this defense not completely fall apart without TJ. And I think that's why, if we're ranking importance to the team, obviously Watt's ahead of him. Minkah does have a better shot of just continuing to prove that he is the guy at the position, opposed to TJ, just because of the strength at the edge position. So,
yeah. And when you look at safeties in general around the NFL, it's really hard to make a case that for most teams, the safety is one of their most important players, because that's typically not the case. It's not that important of a position in respect to other things like your quarterback, your trenches, your pass rushers, your cornerbacks. And so in order to have one that truly is a difference maker, you need a guy that can routinely take the ball away and routinely threaten quarterbacks the way that Minkah does. And there are certainly games that the Steelers have played over these past 3-4 seasons, that 3 seasons, 19, 20, 21, 20. Yeah, it's 4 seasons now. There's certainly games that the Steelers don't win if Minkah isn't playing. And that Bengals one is a perfect example. Like, he had the pick, he had the blocked,
the PAT.
So, and so those things don't, I mean, those wins don't happen if Minkah's not there. And so, like I said, I don't think there's going to be a close competition. Maybe a guy like within the division, like a Kyle Hamilton, who had a really impressive rookie season, was a great prospect coming out. There could be potential. And really, Shayne, I feel like when it comes to like star safeties, like really to have that star safety label, these guys are so few and far between. Like, you can honestly, you can go from like the Troy Polamalu, Brian Dawkins, Ed Reed era, and then there's a gap, and then you have like the Earl Thomas, drawn a blank, like Eric Berry.
Berry was elite.
And so there's really, like, you can go years without having like true all-pro level
Like
safeties in the
superstar,
NFL.
yeah.
But I think that Minkah is one of those guys. And in terms of accolades, he's very similar at this stage in his career as like what Earl Thomas was, who's going to be
Yes.
future Hall of Famer. So
Yeah.
interesting to note there. And did you have any other guys that you could think of, Shayne, that would threaten
See,
him for
I
that?
wanted to mention, so obviously there's some of the other veterans, like, you know, Bates is now with the Falcons. We'll see what he can
Mhm.
do on a defense that's not in Cincinnati. You know, obviously Justin Simmons has been a veteran and a really good player. Kevin Byard for the Titans. All those guys are
Yeah.
really good players, but I
Yep.
think they're just like a step below what Minka's been able to do, and that's kind of why you don't really want
Mhm.
to say that they're going to overtake him. A guy to watch out, Javon Holland for the Dolphins. That's the one I'm
Yeah,
looking
Holland's
at where,
good.
like, now that you have Jalen
Mhm.
Ramsey in that secondary where he can be a chess piece, maybe Holland can be a little bit more of a playmaker safety. He can kind of do everything. That's probably the one, ironically, that is probably the
Mhm.
guy that has the best. I would say, actually, if I'm picking a guy to come out and like show up and really show out and show that he could be in that
Mhm.
category, he would be the one I'm looking at for sure.
Yeah, and he could have a huge year. I can definitely see that happening with the moves that Miami's made on their defense. All right, let's go to the other one here. The last of the obvious names. Then we're going to get to some that are a bit less obvious.
Yeah.
But Cameron Hayward, another guy here who, again, he didn't get his big breakout really until partway through his career. I mean, it took him several years
Yeah.
to earn that.
For
I
sure.
think he was 28 years old when he earned his first Pro Bowl. And
I
so
think so.
he got
Yeah.
a kind of a later start, but this guy is going strong at 34 years old, I believe. And so another one who could obviously potentially be an all-pro. He's done it several times in the past. There's no reason he can't do it. I think that the biggest argument against him, Shayne, would probably be that as other guys are continuing on the upward trend, is Hayward going to at least be level? It's hard to expect him to be better in his old age in the final few years potentially of his NFL career. But it's not impossible. We've seen this guy. He's kind of defying age already. But we have to assume that he's at least a guy in contention for an all-pro honor in 2023.
Yeah, you have to consider him because again, he is turned into a true all-pro caliber player as an older player, and it is weird. And I
Mhm.
think part of why even now some people don't think about him when they're talking about the top and tier defensive lineman is because I think everyone just assumes, even though he really came on strong later in his career, that eventually it's going to stop happening. He's not going to be that
Yeah.
top flight player anymore. And at this point, kind of like the whole thing with, like, if you remember, people were every year after he turned like 38, they're like, oh, Tom Brady's going to fall off eventually. Like, not this can be the same thing as this is defense, this is not quarterback, but like, I'm not going to predict him to just fall off at this
Mhm.
point. Like, he's going to have to do it or show me something that suggests that before I make that like claim that he's going to fall
Mhm.
off. So it's still possible. I mean, you have Aaron Donald had a rough year last year on a bad Rams team. Who knows if they're going to be any good? So he's a guy that probably still going to get that honor if he's healthy, right? Like, you can just slot him in. There's a lot of guys after that that are really good players that just got paid, especially like Jeffrey Simmons, looking at guys like that, Quentin Williams, who is going to get
Mhm.
paid, Dexter Lawrence, a lot of great interior players that are still young and upcoming. But I mean, right now, if I had to pick a guy that wasn't Aaron Donald to give me a game, it's going to be hard for you not to pick him.
Yeah.
Bias aside, like, consistency in the run and pass game, just the strength to be able to hold up if you need him to do that for you too in the run game.
Mhm.
There just isn't really anything he's bad at, and he hasn't been bad at anything in years. It's just that, so for me, he has a chance solely based on what he's shown, and I think that unless he does have a fall off, he's at least going to be in the conversation come the end of the year, especially if he's healthy and this defense stays healthy.
Yeah, I think that is certainly fair. Now, I would say, Shayne, I think that among these first three guys here, and there have been three tremendous players for this
Yes.
football team. I think that Hayward is probably the one that's maybe on the outside looking
Yes,
in
he's the
at that
least likely
award.
for sure. Yes.
Yeah, was a Pro Bowler last year still, but that guy who, again, you've got Chris Jones and Quentin Williams and some of these guys in the primes of their career, potentially getting even better somehow. And so, like we said, Aaron Donald's going to get one of them if he's healthy. I don't see any reason he doesn't, unless he really drops off this year, which, again, it's always possible. It relies on a lot of speed and quickness, which he obviously looks like he still has. So, but just like Hayward, I mean, Hayward, he's got an array of everything. And never was a guy who depended solely on speed. He's got great strength. He's got incredible technique. And so a guy that can last a long time, that Calais Campbell type of guy that can just play forever. But whether or not it's going to be enough, because a lot of that does come down to statistical production, Shayne. And
Yes.
so if he's only getting 8 to 10 sacks, where some of these other guys are getting 12 to 14, that could make the difference in voting potentially. And it also might matter like where Steelers defense finishes. Like, do they come back to like 2019, 2020 defense, where you're top 3 defense in the league? Then I think you get more of a conversation there.
Yeah, I think the health of the defense and how well they're able to play this year is going to be the biggest actually factor for him, especially if he continues to play as he has. It's not going to be so much about whether or not he has the most statistical production, just because you have guys like Highsmith and Watt that are going to get a lot of the sack production realistically if they're healthy. But he's going to make a lot of plays in the run game. He's going to splash a lot. He's going to show a lot of that stuff. I think if he's in the same realm as some of the top guys statistically, but their defenses aren't as good as the Steelers are, I don't like to use that as the basis, but voters care about that stuff. It's just what it is. Like, if you're the best defender on the planet and your defense is ranked 32nd, you probably weren't the best defender anyway, just maybe statistical production, but also, did it matter? It really didn't matter in that case. So I think that's his best outlook, is for the team defensively to really just, again, all 3 of these guys, if they were the number 1 defense, all 3 of them have a shot to be all pros. Like, because for us to be the number 1 defense, they're probably all going to have to play at an all pro level realistically. So
yeah, and it's happened before with all 3.
It has, exactly. So like, that's not out of the realm of possibility. I think he's definitely 3rd on this list for a reason, of our like more no brainer types, but I'm not going to rule it out with him at this point.
Yep, I would agree as well. All right, now we're going to get into a few names here that have never been all pros before. And so the first one on the list is tight end Pat Freiermuth, who we've talked about pretty extensively already on this podcast. I think the trajectory is exactly what you could envision as like the best possible scenario. When the Steelers took him in the 2nd round, like, you make that big 2nd year jump. You're going into year 3. We've seen a lot of tight ends have a really big breakout year in year 3. In terms of all pro honors, again, it's going to get really hard to get past the top few guys. But if that statistical production is there, if he's responsible for helping Pickett kind of take that next step forward, and if the trajectory continues the way that it has been already, where he can go from 11.5 yards of reception to 12.5. And if he can get those the touchdown numbers back up there again, look, it's definitely going to be an uphill battle. But I think he's a guy, because of where he finished, he has to be at least in that conversation. I mean, in terms of like Pro Football Focus numbers, he finished as the 6th best tight end in the NFL last year in terms of his overall grade. And he was top 6 in pretty much all receiving departments. And so this is a guy who is a good young football player on the rise. And I can see it happening. Where it's going to be really challenging is you've got a pair of remarkable tight ends, and actually a trio of them in the NFL right now. Like, there's no chance Travis Kelce's not getting it unless he's injured. Right. This is the most productive tight end year to year that we've ever seen before. George Kittle is going to be up there if the guy can stay healthy, and Mark Andrews is that 3rd guy who is really hard to beat out because he's just so consistent. And now getting his quarterback returning, hopefully for a full year for his sake, that's going to be really hard to top him as well. So I think, obviously, if we're just looking at accolades, I think Pro Bowl is much more likely,
yes,
for Freiermuth than all pro, obviously. And that case can be said with anybody. But because there are some really good tight ends at the top, Dallas Goedert's another one. You really have probably four to maybe 5 guys on that list that you're like, you've got to really climb that ladder, and you've got to get above 3 of those guys in order to get one of those 2 all pros.
Yeah, and for me, so I wanted to give the offense some love just because I wanted to talk about some of the players I think could have a big leap this year. So Pat is the first one that you look at, because receiver, it's just not going to happen in this offense. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how good they play. I don't think they're going to be productive enough. I think Pat's the one that, if he stays healthy and he is the focus of the offense, which I'm hoping that that at least to a certain degree he is, because again, he's the most consistent player we have going for us right now on offense. It's just true. Like, Pickens is the most efficient, but he's a 2nd-year player who only has a really right now kind of a really narrow skill set. Pat's the one that, if this offense is going to take a huge leap in passing production, it's probably going to be because of him. And if you look at last year, like you said, 6th tight end in terms of Pro Football Focus grade, also happened to be the 6th tight end in receiving. I think that if he can get close to or above 1,000 yards, only Travis Kelce did that last year. If George Kittle obviously has the advantage of, even if he doesn't produce a ton of yards, he's probably going to get a significant amount of touchdowns in the red zone. He's probably going to be one of the best blockers in the league at tight end. So there's going to be that factored in. But if Freiermuth can outproduce the rest of these guys pretty significantly besides Kelce, which I think isn't really out of the question. Hawkinson was the second leading receiver last year at tight end. I don't expect that to repeat. Not that now that they brought in Addison to be the receiver 2 for them. I think Osborne will take away touches from him as well. I don't think they're planning on having him be that highly rated as a tight end in terms of yards. Andrews is kind of the one that I'm looking at the most outside of Kittle, where like if Lamar can play a full season and this new offense with Todd Monken is better in the passing game, which it pretty much has to be, that's the guy that I think could really knock Freiermuth out to like 4 or 5, opposed to trying to compete with Kittle for 2. That's really the question, I think, for
Yeah.
me. But if he can get up there again, like this is not impossible. It's just going to take Kittle kind of having a down production year, which he's shown before, unfortunately for him, and Andrews kind of not taking that leap back up into the stratosphere that he's been at before.
Yep, I agree. I think that we can go ahead and pencil a name in there. That's Travis Kelce, assuming the guy stays healthy.
Yeah, healthy Travis Kelce is going to get all pro.
He's going to, and that leaves just one between Kittle and Andrews and Goddard and anybody else who might take that. Maybe Pitts. I don't know how they're going to list him anymore. He's more of a receiver, really, honestly. But
he should be an X receiver for them, but that's beside the point.
And so I think it is possible, but I'm talking about a real outside chance here.
Yes.
In order for it to happen, though, you're right. I think that he's going to have that borderline 1,000-yard season. And the Steelers are really going to have to use him like Baltimore uses Mark Andrews. And honestly, I think that's probably what they should be doing anyway.
They should be,
just what we've seen over the last 2 years is you are more efficient throwing the ball over the middle field to Freiermuth than you are throwing to Deontay. And so let's kind of redistribute those targets there. Let's get more to your budding tight end and less to your receiver, who was a little bit disappointing last year. And again, Johnson can get open. All that is great. But I do want to see more targets go to Freiermuth. And I think that chance is outside. It might even, Shayne, take a few injuries to a few other tight ends in a healthy season from Freiermuth to make it happen. But he is a guy worth mentioning at least. And you talked about George Pickens here and why we didn't include him on the list, because some listeners might be wondering that. To be an all-pro receiver in the NFL, like I just don't think it's mathematically possible for a receiver like Pickens to get that much volume in the passing game to do that, because you legitimately need like 1,400 or 1,500 receiving yards to get into that conversation with the Jamar Chases and the Justin Jeffersons and those type of players. So I don't think that one is as realistic. Both Shayne and I would agree that we think that Pickens will take a jump in year 2. It's just that statistically speaking, he could still be incredibly efficient, but statistically speaking, I don't think he can get enough volume in this passing game to compete with those guys that are getting the 180, 200-ish targets per year. So that's why we didn't have
it's just too hard of an ask, I think, for this offense, especially
a team that wants to run the ball 40 times a game. It's more likely that Freiermuth can get the volume he needs, because the tight end volume in respect to the rest of the league isn't nearly as much as what wide receiver 1 volume is.
Exactly.
So that's the reason why. Next name on the list is Najee Harris, a guy who has made the Pro Bowl in the past, has 2,000-yard seasons. But again, this is why it's important not to just use box score numbers. The results haven't all been there, not what we want in terms of efficiency. But again, the running backs are so reliant on the offensive line and with good blocking, and assuming that the Steelers' offensive line has gotten better, which I think we would agree that it probably will. You're adding a whole new left side potentially of the starting offensive line this year. Najee's going into year 3. Looked better towards the end of the season when they kind of gelled together and the Steelers were able to pound the rock 35 to 40 times a game. This is a guy who could potentially have the volume, enough volume as a workhorse back to receive some all-pro votes. It just depends on what the guys in front of him do, how good Steelers running game is, and the extent of how he's being able to be used. Because if the Steelers do, Shayne, look to more of a bigger split this year between like Najee and Warren than they did last year, that'll lessen his chances. Obviously, you're going to need good volume numbers to be one of those all-pro running backs. Do you think that his shot is good this year, and what players would you put ahead of him on that list?
So for me, when I was looking at Najee, I wanted to put him on this list because I do think even if Warren does get a bigger amount of the touches, this team clearly, in every possible way they could tell us, want to run the football. They want to put the ball on the ground behind their offensive line that they've rebuilt, behind Darnell Washington, behind these tight ends and Connor Hayward, all these guys. They want to pound the football. And to be honest with you, how they're built, I can't really blame them. I still want the passing game to open up more, but it doesn't mean the passing game has to be, conservative. It just has to be, probably less
Mhm.
total attempts than maybe we would like. But they clearly want to run the football. And I think with Najee this year, if he's healthy going into the season, which again, I know we talked to him and you got a chance to talk to him and he said he was healthy.
Mhm.
He wasn't healthy. I'm sorry. He could say he wasn't. I know he was playing, so he can't really say he's injured. That doesn't really work that way. He was not fully healthy for that first part of the season. And once the offensive line gelled and then he got healthy, the runs started getting more and more productive and more explosive. I think that behind this offensive line this year, if they give him enough touches, he's at least going to be up there in the top 5 as far as production at the running back position. Now, I think the
Yeah.
key thing is, what is his touchdown numbers going to look like? Because I think if he is the go-to guy in the red zone in terms of even catching the ball, we saw him make some plays in the red zone in that regard last year. The touchdown to win the game against the Ravens comes to mind, like that type of stuff.
Mhm.
If he is used in that way, if he can get 15, 16 plus touchdowns this year as a runner and receiver, he's going to be up there, like I said, production wise. And it just comes down to how good is the offense. Like, is this an offense that is one of the 5 best rushing teams in the NFL? If they are, he's going to be in that mix because there's a lot of guys that you can look at. Jonathan Taylor could have a bounce back year. Dalvin Cook is going to be on a new team, but he was in his productive last year. Derrick
Yeah.
Henry, can he hold up for a full season at this point? Because he's been kind of the guy as far as rushing leaders for the past few years, but obviously mostly because of the amount of touches and everything else. Is he going to be able to keep that up? Nick Chubb in the division is obviously very talented, but they seem to be moving more towards the passing game with now that Watson is back there. So like his touches might not be up to par compared to Najee. He'll probably be more efficient, we assume, but if he doesn't have as many touches, that could impact his ability to win that award. McCaffrey, like there's a lot of good backs. It's just I think the volume question is really where this starts. Is like, are some of those
Mhm.
top backs, because they're so good and the teams don't want to run them into the ground, especially a team like San Francisco where they could probably afford to give carries to other guys because McCaffrey can just split out as a receiver and he'll be really more that flex, I think, where they have the offense or for all pro now where they have that flex position. He's a candidate for that, I think, more so than just pure running back. So it's
Yeah.
certainly there. Like it's there for the taking. If they want to have a true offensive identity as running the ball this year, Najee's going to have the production, I think, to at least be in consideration.
Yeah, in terms of scheme, offensive line, in the player himself, because we know that Najee is not the fastest player, and that a lot of that attributes to your breakaway run rate and
Yeah,
in how efficient you are. He's going to have a lot of volume because there are going to be running backs that are more efficient in terms of yards per carry, yards per target in the receiving game, that kind of stuff. But I think that the volume could potentially be big enough for how much the Steelers want to run the football that he could at least be in that discussion. Now it's going to be
yeah.
hard again to beat out players like
There's a lot of
McCaffrey
good
and Nick
backs.
Chubb, like
Yes,
those.
absolutely.
Yes, with many others, obviously that we can name, and Derrick Henry can get back in that conversation. I think a sneaky one this year, Shayne, is Tony Pollard on behind
Yeah,
Dallas's offensive
you
line
just want to
without
see how
Ezekiel
his
Elliott.
knee, like how his leg holds up from that injury.
Yes,
But
returning from
yeah,
injury, but he was really good last
he was
year, and
awesome
so
last year. Yeah,
so there are definitely
yeah.
guys around the league and guys that maybe we don't think about as often who can kind of put their name in that discussion as well. Like maybe a Travis Etienne jumps up there this year, or
Saquon
Brees Hall.
Barkley, if he doesn't hold
Got
out, you know,
Yeah, Saquon. And
yeah,
so there's a lot of running backs. So there's just a lot of
there
running
is.
backs in the league, and there's a lot of quality players. And so it is going to come down to a combination of both volume and efficiency. If he can have the right combination of the two, he can at least put himself in that conversation to get all pro votes. I have a hard time thinking he's going to be favored above some of
No,
those
not fair.
perennial all pro guys, but it's not impossible. And like you alluded to already, it might come down to touchdown numbers. Like if he's close in some other departments and he's getting 16 touchdowns compared to maybe Chubbs that takes a step back and has 10 or 12, maybe that makes a difference too. So just another name to throw out there, more likely than a guy like Pickens or Deontay Johnson, because of the volume that in the intent to run the football this year from the Steelers. At least that's the plan. So a guy that we can mention. We've got one more name on the list for you here, and I would like to hear. You can drop a comment in the YouTube on
Yeah,
the channel if you have any others that you think we should have mentioned. But our last
right.
name that we're going to share here is offensive guard Isaac Seumalo. Has not played a snap yet for the Pittsburgh Steelers, but we know that this is a quality football player. Like we've seen him on that Eagles offensive line, albeit sandwiched between other all pros there, but he's just looked really good. And I think he's been a borderline top 10 guard for a couple of years now, especially when he's healthy. This is a guy who can come in and make a pretty sizable impact right away. Now, the Steelers haven't had a Pro Bowl offensive guard since David DeCastro retired, and they were fortunate to go from Faneca and a little bit of a break, and then DeCastro to have those all pros for years. And now they kind of have a gap where they haven't had one. Could Isaac Seumalo be that next guy for them?
I think this is the reason I wanted to put him on, is because when you look at the Eagles' offensive line last year, especially, there's so many great players, and so it's really hard to distinguish guys from each other. But the way that
Yeah.
they talked about him, I got to watch more of them this past couple of weeks, looking at stuff for him, especially being brought to this offensive line. I think because he's no longer surrounded by so many great players, his play is going to stand out more. And I really think he on his
Mhm.
own stands out more so than you would think he would on a great line like that. His place does speak for itself. I think if this offensive line takes a step where we are a top 5 running team and our pass protection holds up well enough where it's certainly not their fault if the offense isn't good in the passing game, he's going to be looked at as a big reason why. And I think he is going to be a big reason why if it does happen because of his ability, especially in the run game. But he's a rock and pass protection. So there's no one has anything bad to say about the guy. You look at anything that they've said about him, especially the Eagles while they've had him, they all think that he's going to be an incredible player for us. I'm not going to say that they're wrong because those guys know what they're talking about. So for me, he's the one on the offensive line. If we're looking at somebody to break out per se, or to really elevate this group in this first year with this new offensive line, he's going to be the one that's going to do it, I imagine. James Daniels is still very
Mhm.
young, but we kind of know what he is. He's a Pro Bowl-esque caliber player at best. I don't see him as an all-pro type. Siamalo, though, has shown that ability, I think, honestly, in the past, especially this past year at the Eagles. So you hope that he can bring that type of play to the Steelers this
Mhm.
year.
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't got a chance to catch up on some Isaac Seumalo tape, when looking at him in terms of comparing to like James Daniels, where I think they're both great pass protectors. I think that Seumalo is the overall better player in terms of run blocking. He
Yes.
still has great feet. He is incredibly smart, just like Daniels is as well. But just the better overall player and stronger at the point of attack. And so I think if those are the two that you would point to say if one of these guys is a Pro Bowl or potentially an All Pro player, it'd be one of their guards. But it
Yes.
would be Seumalo over James Daniels based on the tape that I've seen of him with the Eagles, assuming he doesn't take a step back and look like a worse player on a obviously potentially worse offensive line. We're hoping, like you said, Shayne, that he stands out and looks
Yes.
like this really quality player. Now, a thing that can make it challenging for him, Shayne, is a lot of times for this all-pro voting when it comes to offensive line, it almost works as like a unit. And so
Yes.
we've seen in the past, like these Callahan offensive lines, like the
Yeah.
Cleveland Browns, where
Yeah.
everybody looks good. Like, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter
pretty
who's out
much.
there.
Yeah.
Everybody looks good on the offensive line. You getting 3-4 Pro Bowlers out there. The Steelers have had that in the past. And during their Mike Munchak era, they've had 3 Pro Bowlers on their offensive line and 2 All-Pro players simultaneously with DeCastro and Pouncey, and
Yeah.
then Villanueva was a Pro Bowler.
Mixing in a Pro Bowl.
So
Yeah.
so the offensive line coach matters so much. The unit matters so much in terms of these accolades, unfortunately. So it's hard for one individual to stand out, especially if the rest of the group isn't doing well. But I will say, Shayne, that if the rest of the group takes a step forward, if Broderick Jones comes in there and looks like a significant improvement over Dan Moore, if Mason Cole and James Daniels take another step, and maybe even a core 4 as well, you have to have at least a solid mid-level starting unit, I think, to give Seumalo a chance. But perhaps in addition to that, maybe he can stand out enough and be dominant enough on his own to say, look at this guy, give this guy some votes for all pro here. If he weren't to make it, Shayne, there are a few other guys who happen to be really good at the position right now. Like Chris Lindstrom was awesome
Yeah.
last
He's
year.
kind
He
of
doesn't
the
get talked
guy
about
right
very
now.
often
Yeah.
because he was on a
Honestly,
kind
for
of a
me.
dumpster fire team. Yeah, Lindstrom of the Falcons. And so there are some guards out there who are kind of sneaky good right now. And I think that the league is finally catching up to how good some of these players are. Obviously, a guy like Quentin Nelson obviously has the pedigree to be able to bounce back and be one of those type of players. And so it's certainly an uphill battle. The chances are slim of him
Yeah,
doing it,
I would say.
considering he's in the latter stage of his career, late 20s now, and never has done it at any point in his career so far. But that doesn't mean you can't start late. Like we saw, Villanueva was one of those guys who started late in terms of all Pro Bowl accolades, never earned an All Pro, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I would say that he's the guy to look for, though, if this team takes a huge leap on offense, with the blocking,
Mhm.
especially. And if they do finish top 5 in rushing and Pickett looks much better, he's likely, if we're being honest, going to be the guy
Yeah.
that made that happen. Like that. So that's why it does matter how much the rest of the other guys perform, like how well they perform, because again, if he's the bright spot on a bad offensive line, that doesn't get you all Pro Bowls. That just means you're
Mhm.
probably maybe a Pro Bowler. Maybe you just get talked up a lot by the guys who actually know what they're talking about with offensive line. That's probably the ceiling for a guy like that. But if this team can improve greatly as a pass protection unit and they can get this running game into the top 5, which based on volume alone, they might get close anyway. But if they can be efficient as well, that's when you're going to see, people talking more about him more than ever, probably.
Yeah, and if this line does take that next step, Shayne, we have to assume that Isaac Seumalo
Yeah,
has
he's a
done
big
his
reason
part, and
why.
that
He's a big reason why.
and that he was a great addition. And so we're hoping that's the case. Whether he earns that or not, what's most important to see is if this line is improved. If we can see an improved offensive line, it's going to give Kenny Pickett a chance. It's going to give Najee Harris a chance. It's going to give the Steelers a chance to truly take a big jump forward on offense, and we know that they need it. They average 18.1 points per game last season. We'd like to see that take a massive step forward this year. And Steelers, like we said, they're kind of that quiet team right now, 4th in their own division in the AFC North in terms of odds to win the division. That was the same case last year, Shane, and they ended up finishing 3rd, and the Browns were 7-10, and the Steelers were 9-8. And so hard to count this team out when Mike Tomlin's the head coach. They consistently seem to perform better than teams, than analysts and whoever else assumes that they would. So excited to see what's in store here. We're going to bring you some more content as we lead up to Steelers training camp. And Shane and I are so excited to cover that here in just about a month. So join us next week at this time. Thank you for joining us today on the show. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Still Curtain podcast. And thanks for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.